Thank you. I just have to start by thanking Bill. I wish Zach Davis were here to thank in person. Paul Edwards has made all of this possible. I couldn't have found my way through the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints without his help, but no one has been more important in writing this book and understanding Mormon theology than the man here to my left, a great scholar and a great friend to this book.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to say it's an absolute delight to be here. Jonathan and I are really, really old friends that go back almost a year. But we
almost 2 years to be. Yeah,
so years. We met over dinner, and I just felt an immediate connection. I have to say, there's one reason why I love Jonathan above all other reasons. And I hope I live long enough to hear somebody in my own faith tradition say this. My favorite sentence in his book: theology matters. Yes! Somebody gets that. But I want us to start off tonight this way. I thought one of the loveliest moments in that beautiful evening last night at the weekly lecture where Jonathan spoke was in the Q&A when you said that the one thing I hope everybody takes away, if nothing else, is when you find somebody across the aisle, across the boundary of disagreement, the best question to ask is, what life experience led you to have this opinion or value? And so I want to turn that question on you and ask if, by way of introduction, you could answer that question for us.
Well, thank you. What an amazing crowd. I'm usually lucky if I can get a crowd of 6. I was born in 1960. I'm about to be Medicare eligible. I knew from a young age that I was different from the other kids. I didn't have a word for it, but I knew very young that I was attracted to boys in a very strange way. And I was Jewish, which made me an outsider in Phoenix, Arizona. But at the same time, I knew that the faith, the belief in God and the supernatural, it made no sense to me. I tried at one point being religious, and it just didn't work. It didn't make sense. Why would a benign and all-powerful God create such a flawed and often dark world? I had a very bad attitude toward Christianity growing up because I saw it, not, by the way, entirely incorrectly, as a source of ignorance and prejudice and hate toward people like me. I went on a journey of getting to know Christians, beginning in college, and began to understand that there is such a thing as a sincere and Christ-like Christianity. I read the Gospels in a good secular translation, which everyone should do, and became acquainted with the radicalism of Jesus Christ, whose teaching is orthogonal to everyone before and everyone after, including, by the way, many Christian commentators. And nonetheless, in 2003, I was in an intellectual place where I wrote what I now categorize as the dumbest thing I ever wrote. And I did write in 2015 that Donald Trump would never be president. So this is dumber. And this was an Atlantic article that was celebrating the rise of what I called jokingly apatheism. That's apathy about religion. I said, isn't it great that Americans are becoming secular and they don't really care about religion? They're not hostile to it. But most people aren't even bothering with it. I thought religion is a source of divisiveness and often ignorance and rigidity, and we'll be better off without it. What I did not know when I wrote that was that we were on the threshold of trying that experiment. Christianity has collapsed in America. Now we're talking, let's be clear here, I'm talking about white Protestantism. Catholicism, the Black church, we can set to one side. But white Protestantism, the founding faith, still the predominant cultural faith in our country, has collapsed. The numbers are astonishing. What's happened in the last 15 years, and with that collapse has come the rise of a whole suite of bad social indicators, intense animus and polarization, and the substitution of politics as a form of religion, partisan politics. Politics cannot bear apocalyptic expectations, and so I think one of the reasons, of course, not the only one, but one of the reasons America is becoming ungovernable is that Christianity is a load-bearing wolf for our democracy. So I thought to understand these problems, I would have to wade in and understand Christianity. And that led me on the journey through this book and to Salt Lake City.
So for those who haven't read the book, I have and recommend it to you. But could you give us a quick overview of, you got 3 chapters, right? Thin Christianity, sharp Christianity, thick Christianity. So just outline. Then I want to have more of an actual conversation, but still to frame it, if you could talk about those 3 kinds of Christianity and how Madisonian pluralism plays into this.
Yeah, so the core notion is that the founders they warned us that liberal democracy, which is the form of government they gave us, is necessary but not sufficient. It needs to rest on a substrate of what they call Republican virtue. There's a seat right here. You're welcome to it. And that those would have to be supplied by civil society, meaning, for example, civil groups and family, but also religion and Christianity. And that was the bargain they made. We'll give you a constitution and a whole process. And you, faith leaders, faith communities, need to give people the values that will sustain this. Those are values like honesty, civility, lawfulness, truthfulness, and so forth. They told us we would need that. So, Chapter 1, Thin Religion, says what happens when Christianity stops doing that work and fades as a cultural point so that people begin shopping for their values in other places, like pseudo-religions like Wicca and Soul Cycle and QAnon, but also politicized pseudo-religions like MAGA and wokeness. That turns out to be a disaster for democracy because none of those things can provide the moral and spiritual underpinnings that the founders were counting on. Instead, they divide us and make us crazy. So thin religion is what happens when Christianity just kind of fades away, becomes a lifestyle choice or a consumer option, and stops being relevant to people's lives. Then we had another development, a different form of secularization, which I call sharp Christianity, and that's what happens when the church becomes politicized. So white evangelicalism effectively, this is way oversimplifying, but just to move through it quickly, pretty much merged with the Republican Party, starting in the 80s, but really accelerating in the last 15 years. And as it did that, it shrank because people who were not interested in that political agenda left the church. So the church became smaller and more political. I call that sharp because the church became a social and cultural wedge, a pointy spear that begins dividing each other and begins fueling the fires of the culture war. It becomes obsessed with power, which is what Donald Trump promised on many occasions. If you vote for me, you'll have power. It becomes a fearful church. It embraces a narrative of we're in decline, we're under siege, we're losing our country, we must fight and get it back. So it becomes focused on this world instead of the next. Of course, a lot of people don't want that. Pastors hate it. They hate it. They're quitting because of this. And so the church gets smaller and more political, and this becomes a self-fueling cycle, and that becomes a crisis for our democracy. Thick Christianity raises the possibility of a church that is thick in the sociological sense of being both culturally countercultural, having different values than the surrounding culture, and making strong demands on its followers while giving them a lot in return. And it says you can have a thick religion, one that's really doing this job of shaping and moralizing its faithful, while also being aligned with the values of our liberal democracy, James Madison. And all of that thinking was inspired by the example originally of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is doing exactly that. Terrell Givens comes into it because theology matters, and I think we may be about to discuss it. But in the book, I emphasize you have to look inside the black box. of religion. You can't just view it as a vehicle for, economics or sociology or politics. You got to look at its teachings. And this book looks at the teachings of the church. And then for secular readers tries to show how those have been pulled forward into a modern civic theology that is, it's discipling members of the church in how they should approach politics, social media, and those interactions in the civic sphere, something that white evangelicalism is not doing.
Thank you.
Over to you.
So there are a couple of directions we could go with theology. One reason why I love this book is because it's so astute as political analysis. You use a phrase I like a lot, civic theology, and I'm more interested in the theology than the civic. And you're writing more about the civic. Well, you're merging the two, obviously. You use the principle of agency as what you think is a kind of linchpin or foundational idea that you find distinctive in our tradition. So say a little more about that.
Okay, here's where I go on thin ice, because I am now talking about what you were the world's leading expert on. So you should be talking about this, not me, but I will do my best.
Yeah, because I want to hear how.
I want to hear it refracted back.
Yeah.
So when I was out here doing my reporting for this book and talking both to church leaders and ordinary members of the faith, far and away the term I heard most often was agency. This was emphasized again and again. I assume there are members of the faith here. Raise your hand if you've heard the word agency. Yeah, okay, that's pretty much every hand in the room. This was emphasized in your teaching, right? From very early on. So the book tries to get into how agency springs from the church's view of what Protestants call the fall, and which the church rejects as an explanation. They have a much more sensible view, which is that Eve did something courageous in making a choice that allowed for agency. So as I understand agency, here we go, be gentle. Agency is similar to free will in standard Catholic and Protestant theology, but not quite the same. Because free will says that we all have the capacity to make choices for which we can be morally accountable. But Latter-day Saint theology says, looking back at the Garden of Eden, where Eve made decisions that created options that were in fact sinful, that we need more than just the capacity to make moral choices, including bad choices. We need the opportunity to make those choices, because if we're not confronted with real moral dilemmas that include some choices that are sinful, we won't be able to exercise the agency that will allow us to grow morally and thus become closer to God over a lifetime. This is different from free will, because under free will, you can say, well, we have free will, but you shouldn't be allowed to exercise it because you might do the wrong thing, which is pretty much what the Catholic and Protestant traditions have said throughout history. So the notion of agency opens up a space for the church to say, we're going to urge our faithful to make the right choices, but we want to live in a world where people can make wrong choices. And so here's my little pivot where I put my Madisonian hat on. This can lead directly to a theology which says we want to live in a society that is pluralistic, where people with different values can actively make different choices, including choices that the church disapproves of.
No, I think did
that do all right?
Yeah. I guess one of the distinctives, I think, of Latter-day Saint agency is the way in which our conception of agency and its essentiality in the cosmic scheme of things means that we reinterpret the whole story of Eden differently. And so I'll just give a quick example of this. I was talking to Andrew Tien over dinner, 2 years ago. Andrew Teal, Oxford theologian, Anglican priest, loves Latter-day Saints and has a close connection with the Holland family and others. And he's trying to build bridges of understanding. And I asked him once, I said, what is your interest in Mormonism? I know you've got personal connections and all this. I said, but theologically, what turned you on to Mormonism? And he didn't pause. He just said instantly, and he used a term that you'd have to be a theologian to be familiar with. But he said, "Oh, it's the Cappadocian Fathers." And I said, "You're talking about the Cappadocian Fathers." So Cappadocia, area in central Turkey, the Cappadocian Fathers were a group of 4th century Christian theologians, Gregory of Nazianzus, Gregory of Nyssa, and Basil of Caesarea. And I knew immediately what he meant. I said, "You're talking about the theology of assent." And he said, "That's exactly right." And he said, to hear the theology of assent channeled through Joseph Smith was like this miraculous thing to me. So the theology of assent, which was the primary way in which the fall was understood and interpreted in the first 4 Christian centuries, was that life is meant to be educative. And so we have to experience these oppositional things and forces and entities, but it's all part of an educative process that steers us in the direction of divinization or theosis. And that kind of drops out of the Christian consciousness by and large by the early 5th century. And he said it's such a radical retelling, right, of the story of what happens in Eden. And, essentially, I guess lectured 2 classes today at BYU, and twice I had to correct students because they referred to the fall. And I said, no, you're Latter-day Saint. We don't believe in the fall, but we've inherited that language, and so we still use that vocabulary, even though we don't really interpret it that way. So your book develops the idea of agency. It seems to lead to a kind of matter-of-fact conclusion, which I think should be non-controversial, but it isn't, which is that if we hold agency as this sacred principle, then we would naturally want to accord that same agency to others, and that we have a religious sphere in which we practice and preach and exercise our religious principles, but we accord to others. And yet I think, and I want to talk about this briefly because I want to get back to theology, but my sense is that people in the Christian world frequently and far too often, it seems, in my own faith tradition, are misunderstanding what you mean by the word compromise and how that plays in with agency. And I thought you said you gave a wonderful definition of that yesterday. So if you could bring us back to that.
Yes, though I hope we get back to theology. And I just want a moment of personal privilege to tell you something I had in the book that I took out at the suggestion of readers who said it would sound peculiar is a personal note that I was educated into Judaism. We had what we call, we had religious school, and Jews tell a story that is not all that dissimilar to the Augustinian story, which is that Eve defied God, and that was a sin. You're not supposed to defy God. And from quite young, when I was old enough to start figuring things out, that made no sense to me. Why would God give Eve this opportunity if she was not allowed to use it? And in the pre-quote-unquote fall world, humans are cattle, right? They're like cows or sheep. They can't make moral choices. How could it be a bad thing that a space was created for humans not to be animals? So when I hit your writing, and President Oakes, who said the same thing, a light bulb goes on and I go, I must be a Mormon. Because here is a theology of Eve's choice in the Garden of Eden that makes sense. So thank you for that. So the notion of compromise, I talk about this a lot. This is a passion. You can all look up an article I wrote in 2013 called, Rescuing Compromise. And the point put very briefly is that James Madison is a political genius because there are 2 core problems with democracy which have destroyed every single democracy in history until the United States came along. One is, how do you handle ambition, which is very strong, ambitious, demagogic people who take over the system and destroy democracy. We won't name names tonight. But Hamilton warns against this. They all warn against it. And second, what do you do about the problem? He called it the problem of factions. We would call it interest groups. But you get these groups and they all have different ideas and they go to war with each other and maybe one takes over or maybe the whole system falls apart. Madison realizes that you can take these dangerous forces and turn them into positive, constructive, dynamic engines that can be both change engines and stability engines. And you do that by forcing compromise. The Constitution at its core is a compromise forcing mechanism. It says you can't get anything done unless you have compromise across different levels of government, different branches of government, different parties, and different factions.
So that's not the same as compromising principles.
Correct. So what the founders understand that we forgot is compromise does not mean splitting the baby in half or giving up on your values and principles in order to do something that you think is wrong and don't like. Compromise is a dynamic, creative process in which I come into the room with one idea. Terrell comes into the room with another idea. We quickly reach a point of disagreement, but now we have to reach out for third and fourth ideas. Terrell's going to say, what if we get Paul over here and talk about bringing him into it in a way which gives us a third option? Or we start thinking creatively. We begin broadening the coalition. We begin bringing in new ideas. Every 8-year-old understands this, right? Susie wants to play chess and Maggie wants to play checkers. What do? Well, maybe they make up a new game and call it Chesters. Or maybe they go out and find a third or fourth playmate and do something different. So it turns out that compromise, properly understood, is a generative process that brings in innovation. And usually it leaves the system with a better solution than anyone started. That's why the system is compromise forcing. It is, I think, a serious problem that compromise has become a 4-letter word in politics, and people don't understand how essential it is to make our system work.
Okay, I want to change directions completely. I want to talk about the book you didn't write.
That's a lot of books.
and that in some ways I'm trying to. And it comes from just a fantastically pregnant. We're not supposed to use gendered metaphors anymore.
No, we had an election. You no longer have to introduce your pronouns.
So it's just this fantastic sentence that you leave. And I think it's the point of departure for assessing the whole history of Christianity and when and where it's gone a little bit off the ropes. It's on page 29, and you say this. You're talking about the problem of suffering, the problem of evil, the Holocaust. And you say, confronted with that problem, God's defenders frequently retreat into mysticism. Quote, we can't know why God does what he does and allows what he allows, but we should nonetheless assume he has a plan. It's good because he's good. Obviously, this is no answer at all. It is merely a refusal to confront the question. And here's the sentence. To apply moral reasoning to our fellow humans while excusing God from all critical appraisal is to turn off our brains and license a capricious, sometimes monstrous divinity. And I think that's the best one-sentence summation of the history of Christianity that I've encountered. And I think it's brilliant. And I tried to crack that problem in my own work. And it emerges, as far as I can see, for the first time, again, it's in the 4th century, where, we begin with this, I think all Christianity would have been very different if John had held pride of place in the canon, but it doesn't. Matthew, because Matthew talks about authority. And so authority becomes relevant to a church that is now aligned with empire, right? And so this fantastic expression you use about Jesus being orthogonal to the culture, well, that orthogonal orientation shifts once you're aligning, right, the interests of the church and the state, which is why another one of your favorite expressions, my favorite, your expressions are my favorite, is you say Christianity is an exilic religion. It's a religion of exile. And yet we've lost that. But I think the problem emerges, this is I'm very personal, maybe informed by my faith, but it's when we look at the suffering in the world and we try to make sense of it and we say, well, God's justice just must be different than our justice. And God's love just must be different than our love. And I think that idea gets deeply entrenched in the way Christianity unfolds. And I think it's still with us today in many quarters. And I think the best single response to that, and the response to that begins in the 17th century, Socinianism and moral philosophy, and we get a number of protests. But the most eloquent one may be Elie Wiesel, who in his book, The Trial of God, in which he's writing a drama to really kind of deal with the problem of the Holocaust. And the most stunning sentence in that book is when he says, if God's good is not our good, then what's the use of any of this? And I think that's the question that it just rings in my mind throughout my reading and study of Christian history. Can I ask you to respond to that? Because you lay the foundations for that.
I have to ask you one more, to elaborate a little bit before I respond, because so another way of putting this question is it's the question of theodicy, why a good God would allow children to suffer from childhood leukemia, die painful deaths, why smallpox, why earthquakes, why torture so many people. And when you boil it down, there are three reasons why I have found that I cannot believe in God, at least not in an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God. I can kind of believe in Greek gods because they're a committee, and committees got up to all kinds of mischief.
Nothing good ever came from committees.
Right, nothing. Right, the world is a horse designed by committee. But it's just one of the reasons. There are three reasons I can't believe in God. One is just my wiring. The second is epistemic, which is the problem that miracles make the world completely random and incoherent. But the third is that if there were an all-powerful, all-knowing entity that created the world as we know it, I would have to oppose it because it does a lot of things that I cannot help but judge as wicked. And I'm supposed to be told, well, we just don't understand the large scheme of things. And I have, as you just said, I have as much problem applying that shrug of the shoulders, we can't judge, to God as I do to people who do the same thing. But what I want to know is, how do you get out of that dilemma as a Latter-day Saint or as a Christian? How do you keep believing in a force? How do you avoid judging and judging negatively this God that you worship?
I think John Rauch just asked me in public to explain how Mormonism resolves the problem of theodicy.
I did.
Which I don't think I'm going to do.
Is that because you can't or because you won't?
It's because I can't. I think we have faith propositions. I think we have a cosmology that gives us new and more creative ways of thinking about the problem. What I will say is, I don't believe that my faith, personal or the community of which I'm a part, answers the problem this way. I don't think it answers it by saying, well, to God, maybe suffering is good in some other context. Here's the problem with this. I call this the God of Anselm. I call it the God of the philosophers, because here's how God comes to be defined in the Middle Ages. God is an agglomeration of all perfections, right? So he's infinite goodness, infinite wisdom, infinite mercy, infinite beauty. The problem with that, if we impute to God just these kind of Platonic absolutes, then you have no reason to believe that you matter more to God than a piece of quartz, because it might be more symmetrical and more beautiful and more aesthetically satisfying, right? So if we are worshiping the God that Jesus claims he revealed, then we have to believe that God is love And everything else has to be understood under that category. Nothing else can explain the priority of relationality in God's scheme of things, or the sacrifice of his son. So whatever solution we come up with, it has to be predicated, seems to me, on the Johannine teaching that whatever God looks like, he's going to look like Jesus. And love is going to look like the baby in the manger and weeping at the tomb of Lazarus and washing the feet of the disciples. And that's God. So one avenue, if not a solution of at least clarity, comes in the fact that Latter-day Saints tend to be thoroughgoing naturalists. We don't have an official theology in this regard, but we tend to believe, and Joseph Smith tended to intimate, that God, it is a proposition, that God didn't create the universe ex nihilo. So that immediately absolves us of all kinds of problems, right? If God didn't create the universe, and he didn't create the human soul, but he is a God in a universe full of all of these things, including independently operating entities called souls. And so to be born into this world is to be born into a sphere in which natural laws operate. And God isn't the author of those natural laws.
So does that imply that God, as it were, inherited the evil in the world, but did not create the evil in the world?
Yeah, I think that's...
Okay, I'm definitely a Mormon.
So, oh, good, okay.
Your work here is done. You know, there's so much to learn from your teachings that would, I think, benefit the world, at least to know about. Because there's a, how shall I put this delicately? There is a theological richness to your scriptural teachings that is not fully captured in the musical The Book of Mormon. There are theological deficiencies in its presentation.
Yeah. So.
By the way, I don't think that the Mormon account which you've just given actually answers the problem of theodicy. But it's more compelling and in a way more generous to God than the conventional Christian alternative.
Yeah.
It doesn't help us all that much with the Holocaust, which God should have stopped. But it helps at least understanding how things like the Holocaust got into the world in the first place.
Yes. My favorite line from C.S. Lewis's book, one of my favorites, is his Paralandra. And it's fantasy, but it's his most profoundly theological work. Because in this work, he tries to imagine an alternate unfolding of the story of the Garden of Eden. And so it takes place on this planet called Paralandra. And it's so rich. But there's one moment when this is a stand-in for Christ, is trying to teach Eve the things that she needs to know without sinning. And the question of agency comes up, and he's trying to get her to understand what it means to be an agent and how agency comes into one's consciousness and comes into the world. And the answer is that it ends up being through imagination, conceptualization. But there's this line that it's just, Branson says, either everything or nothing must depend on human agency. And if everything, then who can set the boundaries? And so again, that to me comes close to answering, it's a gesture towards theodicy, because, I have friends, students who have asked me, my son, okay, he won't be listening to this. He's had one of the hardest, most difficult lives, and my children, my family. And finally, decades of struggling, finally finds this beautiful job He regains his self-worth, his stability. He's in a good place in his life. Business goes bankrupt and he's thrown out of work again. And he writes to me and he says, why would God do this to me? And I said, God had nothing to do with that. The reason you're still in pain is because whoever's in a position to alleviate your pain isn't listening. So, because I think what Lewis said is right. If God can't stop you, if God can't stop the Holocaust, then he certainly can't stop you from losing your job. And so it seems to me that it's kind of an all or nothing proposition.
Yeah, that's lovely. I don't believe in all or nothing propositions. I don't live in that kind of black and white world. For me, the most compelling and honest answer to this problem comes from Pastor Tim Keller, the late great Pastor Tim Keller. Some of you are nodding. Raise your hand if you've heard the name Tim Keller. So he was a real man of God, and I was lucky to become friends with him before he died. I think, is it a year or two ago? 2 years ago, of pancreatic cancer. And he told me, when we discussed this, that he had thought long and hard about the problem of evil in the world, and that his honest answer was, when he threw every argument that he had explaining this problem into a bucket, he could only get that bucket 2/3 or maybe 3/4 of the way full. He could not get that bucket all the way full, and that the rest just had to be faith. And I thought that was an admirable answer. There's a comparable shortcoming on my side of the equation, the atheist side. We have a different problem. I discussed this in the first chapter of the book. The reason that God and science need each other, and always will be interdependent, is that there are two questions we can't answer. And one is there a story about why human beings are present in the world and are more than just a bunch of random cells that blink into the world and then momentarily blink out, leaving no trace behind except some degenerate, decomposed matter? We have no transcendent story about humans. And humans, that's an existential problem. Most people just can't live with that. It turns out I can. I don't mind it, but most people can't and probably shouldn't. And second, we cannot answer the question of, what do you anchor good and evil in that is greater than ourselves, than just our taste, our preferences? And there I said to Tim Keller, well, the greatest of all the secular philosophers have thrown everything they have at that question. And we're talking minds like Plato, Immanuel Kant, who I think was the greatest of them, John Rawls, many others. And everything we throw at it gets us only 2/3 of the way. But we cannot go that final distance of giving an account of why some things are right and some things are wrong that transcend human preference. And that's why I think in arguing the book, this is a point that I don't get the opportunity to talk about, but love to. That's why at a fundamental existential epistemic level, not just the political level, if you need people to have religion so they'll behave well, or you need to have science so that it moderates religion, whatever, but not that. But that at a fundamental conceptual level, both of these accounts of the world, the religious one and the scientific materialistic one, the atheist one, have questions that they answer, but questions that they cannot answer. And the society has got to have both accounts. They will constantly be in tension with each other, but they must coexist. So that's my solution to the problem. It's a hybrid.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to think that one distinctive of our faith tradition is that sense that was so evident in Joseph Smith's life and practice. I've always thought that what's kind of paradigmatic of a uniquely LDS take on the world is that we have this young man who claims God appeared to him, that he's given him this gift that he can translate unknown languages. And then he hires a Hebrew professor to come and teach him and the other elders Hebrew. And then he studies Greek and German. And so it seems to me that he stood for this synthesis that there isn't a discrete supernatural realm that obeys different laws and different principles, but that we have to find a unifying epistemology that dignifies and appreciates the hard labor of intellectual effort and supplement that with an access to spiritual powers or spiritual realities. And
yeah, I was not really exposed to the thinking of Joseph Smith before writing this book, and my understanding of him is still deeply superficial. But I did manage to pick up that he had some ideas about religious pluralism in his day that were far ahead of his time, and in some ways even ahead of our own time. And he, in that respect, others I'm sure, but in that respect, he is orthogonal to other thinkers of his day. And that DNA continues along with the exilic element to this day. I felt, when I came here to research this book, I felt strangely at home in Salt Lake City, because for all of the, I don't know, what would the word be? Not dominance, that's too strong, but prominence of the church here.
dominance is okay.
No. For all of that, a Jew feels like we too are of a minority religion. We too are often misunderstood, and we're an exilic religion. Our temple was never rebuilt. Your temple is not apparently in the promised land. You're in exile here in Salt Lake City. Is that right?
I feel that way, yeah.
So we're both exilic faiths, as Christianity is supposed to be, but these days it's not. And we understand in our bones what it is to be persecuted in ways that mainstream Christians, at least Protestants, tend not to.
I'm going to wrap up this part just with a note of appreciation, and you can respond or not as you're inclined. But I have to say that there was an element of undeserved graciousness in John's presentation last night, as he showed a number of these charts and graphs, beautifully done, show trends in civic behavior, and how, in his language, Christianity broke its bargain with democracy, and what groups were prominent in breaking that. And in most of those slides, Latter-day Saints would have liked to have been at the bottom of the slide, and we weren't always. And I just want you to know that I noticed that.
By bottom of the slide, what do you mean?
Well, what I mean is, at times, for example, where Christianity was sharpest, and certain groups like white evangelicals were the highest percentage of that kind of religion, we would have hoped that we would have distinguished ourselves by being the most tolerant and the most orthogonal and the most. And sometimes we were lost in the mix. And I thought it was a beautiful way of making your point without being direct about it.
Well, something that I learned a little while back is that religion doesn't make people stupid. It's the other way around. And thus, all religions are flawed. And the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is flawed. Its teaching on, for example, loving same-sex relationships is, in my opinion, cruel and wrong. And I pray for a revelation after my lifetime, I suppose, but I pray for a change in that doctrine. And I am aware of the dark aspects of the church history. My very first editor out of college was a woman named Deborah Lake, who had left the church and wrote a scathing memoir about the abuse that she suffered within the church, the emotional abuse, and several years later, she killed herself. So I know those stories. But what's different about this church now is that it has developed and articulated a civic theology, which, as President Oakes puts it, centers on patience, negotiation, and mutual accommodation. That's a fancy word for compromise. Not just because you might like the results, not just because it's good for our democracy or what the founders intended, but because it's what Jesus Christ wants Latter-day Saints to do. And something I also learned from you and others is that your faith is a universal faith. It applies this principle to all humans. It says this is what all humans should be doing. President Oakes is a constitutional scholar. So he knows as well as I do, and is very conscious of the fact that he is aligning church doctrine with constitutional doctrine. You might contrast Christian constitutionalism with Christian nationalism. It's opposite. And he's doing this in a way, they are doing it's not just him. He's preaching something that I think the rest of the country needs to hear. So to the very, very limited extent that in my meetings with church elders this week, I was able to suggest this, my message was, right now, the country needs the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to teach Dallin Oaks, not just to the church, but to the country. And I hope that that could happen.
Thank you. I think we want to spend a few minutes now taking questions from the audience, maybe 15 minutes or so. We could do that. And we don't have mics out there, so if you could speak really loudly.
You talk about thin religion. Why not call it counterfeit religion?
Well, because I was trying to be more polite. I do want Christians to be able to see themselves in this book. And it is, when you read it, you'll find it's a little bit scathing toward Christianity. But I do try to avoid words like counterfeit. And I try to let Christians do the talking in making the most powerful critiques of Christianity. And you'll find some very pointed ones in the book.
If you don't mind just addressing the tension that I live with, in that I see very strongly what you're saying about our teachings for the benefit of pluralism, but I live currently in a culture that is very MAGA, and the state, perhaps not as strongly as other states, the state went very MAGA. And so I know these people who share my same theology are seeing it differently. And I'm just wondering how you've seen the statistics, you know that too.
Yeah, interestingly, until 2016, Latter-day Saints were very much in line in their political identification with Republicans. And around 2016, they shifted away from that, not all the way from that, it's still a very red state, but significantly away from that in a way that evangelicals did not. Evangelicals are joined at the hip with the MAGA movement. So if what you're suggesting is that there are a lot of people in the church, rank and file, who are not necessarily on board with the mission of peacemaking that President Nelson has set out, that's clearly true. And church elders are clearly aware of that. And it turns out that even if you're a senior leader of this church, you can't wave a magic wand and keep the whole culture, the partisan, politicized culture of cable news and social media and apocalyptic partisan extremism, you can't keep that out. You just have to do your best to promulgate doctrines in the faith that you hope will move people in the right direction. That's what I see the church trying to do. They are well aware, as are the secular leaders I've talked to in Utah, that what's called the Utah way is in danger. They say it's getting harder every year to do the kind of conciliatory politics that Utah has prized, both secular politicians and the church. It is a fight to see whether the church can follow through and really inculcate the values that it is working to inculcate. It will not be easy. And I can also tell you from being directly told by this, that the church is listening carefully. It has an ear to the ground to understand whether its message of patience, negotiation, and mutual accommodation, whether that's taking. And what it communicates is not necessarily what church members hear. I think if you're a Latter-day Saint and you're living in this community, I wonder if there's not a little bit of missionary work to be done. I wonder if maybe there might not be gentle and kind ways to communicate to some of these people or remind them of the challenge, and it is a profound challenge that the church has given them, carrying forward the peacemaking project. Thank you.
As an atheist, I wonder how you see our beings coming into existence. For instance, if molecules, I'm referring to Dr. James Tour, if molecules don't care what happens to them and they don't self-organize, and we are so complex, how do you explain our existence on the earth?
You're asking me? Do I look like a biologist?
Oh, but you have mine.
So what atheists like me do is rule out supernatural explanations. We say you can't just say there was a miracle, because even one miracle makes the universe a chaotic place where you can't explain anything, because who knows, God might have changed the rules. But that doesn't rule in anything else. It leaves vast territories of mystery to be solved. And the origin of life is one of them. One of the prevalent theories, only a hypothesis at this point, is that the universe has some self-wiring properties in which there are ways in which molecules can self-assemble and will do so under conditions which are actually quite common in the universe and may even exist under the ice in one of the moons of Jupiter. But that's being tested. We won't know unless we find life in a bunch of other places, and we may never have the answer to that question.
But doesn't DNA and the order, the complex order of DNA itself imply a mind?
No. A mind would need to exist somewhere. It would need a source of energy. It would need to be not only supernatural, but it would need to solve all kinds of problems that are endlessly complex. So introducing the notion of some mind out there that operates on the universe doesn't help you. You then have to explain, okay, so what are the principles organizing this mind? So you're back where you started. Next question.
Thank you so much, Brother Rauch, for being here. I'm using it as a term of endearment because we all gladly welcome you as an unofficial Mormon. I want to ask you,
I'll take that as a compliment. It's intended to you.
I want to ask about a very thought-provoking title of this session. Can Mormonism save American democracy? The obvious barrier for such a thing happening is that Mormons, as we used to be called, are not really held in high esteem in many quarters of this country. There are still many who not vote for an otherwise qualified LDS person for president, for example. I believe that recently a Pew research study showed that Mormons are thought to be among the most tolerant denominations, but they are the least tolerated, or at least among the least tolerated by most others. So how do you suggest that problem be addressed? If there are tenets of our faith that could be helpful in solving America's problems, Americans would have to be receptive to them.
So Mitt Romney got a lot of votes. He was the presidential nominee, and he didn't lose, in my opinion, because he was a Latter-day Saint. He lost for other reasons. Among them, Barack Obama was incumbent president. So it is not impossible at this point, I think, for a member of your faith to become president. I think that public opinion about the church has been shaped by earlier versions of the church, which are no longer current. And stories like the one I just told you about my first editor. It always takes public opinion years to catch up. I think that the best thing that the church can do, both for its image, to the extent it cares about that, but also for the church, is to explain its doctrines in a patient way, and leave it to the public to understand if it makes sense. But these things take time. You know, when I asked members of the church about this reporting, they had an interesting attitude. One guy said, yeah, sure, we're persecuted and misunderstood, but so what? That just means we need to go on about our work as best we can and not be deterred. And I think that's exactly the right attitude. By the way, Christianity has always done its best missionary work when it is exilic and when it is countercultural. That's an advantage, not a disadvantage in modeling the behavior of Jesus Christ.
We're going to end with your question.
I echo my thanks and welcome to both of you being here. This might be a bit of a searching, amorphous question, so please bear with me. It seems to me that one of the great problems of a pluralistic society, where there is an agency, is the problem of offense. If you live in pluralism, you must be willing to be offended by the views of others, the actions of others, etc. Elsewise, you get this surge of polarity to put down the offenses of another side. I suspect that you, coming from minority persecuted groups, have suffered many offenses in life. What counsel would you give to the country to how do you deal with offenses in order to be a citizen of a pluralistic society?
Well, I kind of wrote two books about that. One, which was written 32 years ago, is called Kindly Inquisitors, The New Attacks on Free Thought. And it said, long before wokeness, that going around with a thin skin, looking for ways to be offended, to call people out, to do what now is called cancel culture, that is not a Republican virtue. That just as you said, in a pluralistic culture, yes, we have the right of free speech, but we also have obligations to be offended. I've profoundly disagreed with the people who told me that because I'm a homosexual, I'm not entitled to get married. It was not fun going door to door in this country and begging straight people, oh, please, can't we get married too? That said, this is something that probably should resonate with Christians. I would not trade in any of the opportunities I've had to both be offended and to try to do my best to use those as opportunities to proselytize for the equality that has been the mission of my life. I think being a marginalized community, being a moral exception, how difficult though it may be, is also a fantastic privilege because marginalized people are the leaders. They are the first people to see injustice and always the leader in remedying injustice. And so that means that I see exposing oneself to an environment where other people can be bigoted and offensive is not only an obligation in our society, but it's also an opportunity. And I think we should embrace it. That is a difficult attitude to maintain, of course. It's a very difficult attitude to maintain. And far too many of my friends in the LGBT plus activist community are not showing that spirit, unfortunately. We need to do better.
Thank you. So let me just conclude by thanking you for coming. And I'm going to turn it over to Bill. But before, can I just say that I feel personally privileged to have had this evening with you. And I think I speak for many of us when I say we're grateful to have you as a friend, but also as an inspiration.
Thank you. That is very, very good.
Thank you so much again for coming. I think we've had a few breakthroughs tonight. I think we got an atheist to proclaim himself Mormon. We got an atheist to pray for revelation, and the theodicy problem is going to have to wait till dinner. And if we don't get it solved, then we'll invite you back and we'll figure out the problem of evil. And I think we found a wonderful conversation partner with Jonathan. I'm sure we'll be inviting you back if you're willing to continue to engage. And thank you so much for coming tonight. We have more gatherings like this. You can go to the faithmatters.org website and become apprised of those upcoming events. I'll have a lot of them here. But thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And you're going to sit over here and sign a book or two if we can find them.
I'll do what I'm told.
Thank you again so much. What a delight.